everyone, my name is Jiaqi, and I will introduce this paper entitled Being Robust Can Be Practical. So this paper is based on some robust estimation we've seen in the lecture. So to complete the story, let me first recap some concepts. Estimating a distribution is well started for many cases. For example, given samples from a Gaussian distribution, we can learn this distribution through like empirical mean and covariance, and they will converge to the truth given enough samples. However, if we replace the epsilon fraction of these samples, estimating the distribution can be challenging. To simplify the task, here I will assume the distribution has covariance 1, and in the rest of my presentation, I will only focus on estimating mean of some distribution with a known covariance. And the empirical moment actually is affected by the corrupted samples. Fortunately, empirical median works, and it is well known that given sufficiently large size of samples, the empirical median is optimal up to a constant factor. But it is only for low-dimensional data, like data with 2 or 3 variables. When high-dimensional data emerge more and more recently, previous robust estimations will break down. Let's say, given a corrupted set of d-dimensional Gaussian samples, we want to estimate the mean vector. And there are several methods feasible, like, for example, the geometric median is computationally efficient with polynomial time, but estimation error has an extra term, the root of d. So the error can be large, especially for high-dimensional data. And some methods like Tukey median and tournament have optimal error guarantees, but the computational time cost is not practical. And other methods like pruning and ransack also have suboptimal error. So overall, this method cannot achieve both tight error bound and efficient computation. To overcome this problem, EKK16 actually proposed an algorithm called filtering. And we've seen this intuition behind it in the class, and I will explain more details about it. The idea is that if adversaries corrupt empirical mean, they must also corrupt the empirical covariance. So the high-dimensional data can be seen as distribution in this ring belt. Like the blue points are good samples and the red points are some bad samples we add to corrupt the data set. After adding the red points, actually the mean of the whole data set shifts from the blue cross to the red cross. Moreover, the covariance also shifts from the blue circle to the red ellipse along the same direction. And we can find there are many bad points, red points on this direction. And this direction also, as you can see, is the direction of eigenvectors. So the paper found that first, the top eigenvector of empirical covariance actually gives a direction that's dominated by the corrupted samples. And in this direction, the corrupted samples responsible for large shift in empirical mean are also far from the mean. So we can project all the samples to the direction of top eigenvector and remove outliers by removing tails. So similar, like for 1D Gaussian distribution, we have such concentration inequality, and removing samples beyond like root log 1 over epsilon can remove outliers with high probability. Similarly here, the essential point is finding a threshold T to remove samples that violate the concentration inequality on the projection. Concretely, the input of the filtering algorithm is an epsilon corrupted set of samples of d-dimensional Gaussian distribution with an unknown mean vector and identity covariance. We also need empirical mean and an empirical covariance. So the algorithm is that if the spectral norm of difference between empirical covariance and the true covariance is not too large, then we can see the samples are not corrupted too much, and we are okay with the empirical mean. Otherwise, we need to clean the dataset. So we first find the top eigenvector V of the empirical covariance. Then we can find a positive value T such that the concentration inequality has this formulation on the projection of V. And so we remove samples that violate this inequality and do these steps repeatedly until samples are clean enough, and we can return the empirical mean for remaining samples. The paper actually has detailed proof on these equations, and I can give you some high-level description. So here, this omega epsilon log 1 over epsilon is a threshold function. Like it determines where your filtering can stop, and the samples are good enough to give a reliable estimation. And in this inequality, the right size part is the tail bound. Here they choose this value to make sure only tau fraction of uncorrupted good samples are removed. And this value actually comes from the property of Gaussian and some property of the corrupted dataset. And you may refer to the paper for more details. Anyway, they prove that this filtering algorithm gives dimension agnostic error O epsilon root log 1 over epsilon. It is optimal up to a logarithmic factor. And the computation is also efficient with polynomial time. However, the filtering algorithm still has problems. It is only analyzed for Gaussian, and it has high sample complexity because it will aggressively remove samples. I can see the sample complexity is obviously suboptimal by a polynomial factor. So the filtering is not practical. To solve this issue, this paper tried to generalize and improve the filtering by first relaxing assumptions to give nearly optimal sample complexity, and second, proposing solutions for sub-Gaussian and distributions with bounded second moment. So let me begin with the sample complexity. Actually, I don't very understand the proof of this part in the paper, but I guess I can at least elaborate on some intuitions. So in previous analysis, they assume all samples before the corruption follow a tight tail band, which is necessary because we don't want to remove many good samples, and we want good samples stay close to the mean. But this assumption is held uniformly, and we need many samples to satisfy the assumptions in theory. However, this paper states that we can relax this assumption because as long as we remove more bad samples than good samples, the algorithm is fine, which is we can find some value t, and roughly epsilon over t squared fraction of samples are bad samples that violate the concentration inequality. And we can remove some good samples as long as they are no more than epsilon over t squared. So we can remove good samples if they are not too much. And this paper uses the same proof in the KK16 paper with a relaxed assumption, and this will give sample optimal analysis, and I will show you how optimal it is later. Another contribution is this paper actually generalized the filtering to more distributions, and the essential point is designing proper threshold function and tail bound for the distribution. Recall that for Gaussian distribution, we have such formulation, and it first extended to sub-Gaussian distribution. And sub-Gaussian is a general class of distributions with parameter nu having such a concentration inequality. Specifically, when nu is equal to sigma squared, sub-Gaussian will degrade to Gaussian. And for sub-Gaussian, it has the same threshold as Gaussian and a slightly different tail bound. Here, the tail bound is dependent on the distribution parameter nu. Then for the distribution with bounded second moment, this paper actually let the threshold function to be exact 9 and remove samples with probability proportional to this deviation. Like the paper proved that this removing actually can remove more outliers than inliers in expectation. So this will fulfill our requirements. And for now, the filtering can deal with different settings. And in previous analysis, it is only analyzed on Gaussian data with very high sample complexity. Now in this paper, First, for sub-Gaussian, it still have nearly optimal error and fast computation, and the new proof shows that the sample complexity is O tilde of d over epsilon square. And this is for the distribution with bounded second moment. You can see the sample complexity is O tilde of d over epsilon. So overall, the filtering now has nearly optimal error, efficient computation, and sample optimality. And for the experiment, first on synthetic datasets that generated from identity covariance Gaussian and 10% fraction of corruption, the filtering actually has the lowest L2 error on mean estimation, especially in high-dimensional settings like 300 or 500 features, and the filtering will outperform all the baselines. And also, to evaluate the algorithm on real data, the paper conducted a similar experiment from a famous study called Genes Mirror Geography within Europe. And in that study, researchers showed that first two principal components of genetic data actually provide surprising resemblance to the geographical map of Europe. But that study actually did some manual work to remove noise in the data, like removing data of immigrants. So, and this paper wants to say if filtering still works when the noise exists. So given the original clean data, they added some noise to it, which are these black circles, and one baseline method, pruning, actually produced a result like this. You can see our points are mixed up, and the filtering output is much better. It still maps the geography of the map. So this experiment demonstrates that the filtering can be useful in real-world data analysis, particularly those in high dimensions. Finally, the summary. So the filtering actually provides a robust estimation paradigm that we can use threshold to check certificate, use tailbound to remove outliers in the subspace based on the top eigenvector. So I think this framework can be also useful for more general settings, like for other different types of distributions. And the paper also proved that the filtering can be practical for analysis because it's sample optimal with optimal error bound and fast computation. And also in the presentation, I only explain estimating mean vector with known covariance, but the filtering can also be used for covariance estimation by looking at the fourth order moment. And if you are interested in it, you can check the paper. And that's all. Thanks for your listening.